Hi, this is Andre. In the previous video, we looked at some fundamental characteristics to be aware of when choosing a MIDI controller. We're going to stick with that line of study, but this video is a lot more subjective and dictated by my own personal biases and preferences. My own use of MIDI controllers focuses on live looping hardware and software. That means that there are some relatively obscure aspects of MIDI control that are very important to me, as well as some very popular MIDI elements that I don't tend to deal with in my work. So I definitely feel that the subjects in this video are worth being aware of, but I also acknowledge that my own interests in this area tend to get pretty unusual and that we'll delve into some pretty obscure and geeky territory here. In this video, we make references to three specific controllers: the Behringer FCB 1010 pedal, which I've been using for 16 years, the Arturia Beatstep, which I got about a year ago, and the Morningstar MC8, which is a very recent acquisition for me. The FCB and Beatstep have already been featured in many of my previous videos, but I haven't covered the Morningstar yet. It's a truly amazing piece of gear, and I'm really excited to discuss it, but as of yet I haven't done any videos with the Morningstar in action, so think of the references to it in this video as a preview of coming attractions. Alright, so let's assume that we have good candidates as far as a controller that will send the right kinds of commands to the device we want to control, and we're able to make the right kind of connections. In my opinion, one of the next things to look at is banks, and banks have to do with the current collection of functions that are assigned to all the buttons or switches. So for instance, if I call up the Beatstep, a bank is a specific collection of all of these different buttons plus all of these different knobs. And it's an assignment. So basically, for one bank, I might say, this is going to be record, overdub, multiply, insert, replace, etc., etc. If I change banks, I can have all of these controls, or some of them, be set to different functions. So I might have another bank where this changes loop numbers, or this might send musical pitches so that I can play the pitch of the loop melodically if it's that kind of looping device. But having multiple banks that you can switch back and forth between may or may not be a big deal for you. For me, it's pretty important, just because I like being able to switch around between a lot of different types of functions. And I also find that grouping functions based on certain types of applications is really helpful. Now, depending on what you want to do with MIDI, you may not need a lot of banks. You may be fine with just one bank, depending on how many MIDI switches a particular device has. It is good to be aware of how many user-configurable banks there may be in a device. When I say user-configurable, I mean that certain controllers come with banks that are preloaded. You see this in foot controllers quite a bit. A lot of foot controllers are largely designed, at least in part, to be able to control certain DAWs or certain audio programs. So some of them will have presets so that you can plug it in and immediately start accessing functions in Logic Pro or Ableton Live or Cubase or Pro Tools. Now, for what we're talking about, a controller should have at least one user-programmable bank. In other words, at least one bank where you can specifically assign what every particular button or switch or knob is going to do. Some of the devices don't have a ton of them. Some devices only have one or two user configurable banks. Another consideration is, can you save a bank as a patch on a computer and either save it there or reload it from a computer back onto the device? Depending on the device you're using, you may find that you run out of banks sooner than later. Along those lines, another consideration is, does the controller have a software editor? Can you edit the parameters on a piece of software that you connect to, or do you have to do the editing on the device itself? Doing the editing on the device itself is not necessarily a terrible thing. The Behringer is notorious for being challenging to edit on the device itself. I can do it, but that's only because I've done it a lot. In doing some research for this series of videos, I found a librarian that will let you edit patches on the Behringer on a computer. I used it long enough to figure out that it would indeed work, but I've never actually put it to the use of storing presets or moving patches back and forth. The Morningstar and the Arturia Beatstep both have fantastic software editors. They're very nicely laid out. They let you look at exactly what's going on a control. They give you a lot of flexibility. They're very intuitive. I like them a lot. Not all controllers are necessarily going to have that. Again, this is not necessarily a make or break kind of thing, but it is good to be aware of. And if it doesn't have some kind of software editor, try to do a bit of research and find out how easy or challenging it tends to be to try and program things through the interface itself. Having a MIDI input and the ability to pipe the signal from the input through the pedal and send it out is another consideration. There's basically two reasons you would want to do this. The first would be, let's say that you have a looper that you want to have synchronized through MIDI. You want it to receive MIDI clock from Ableton Live or Digital Audio Workstation. So you're sending the MIDI clock to the looper, and the MIDI input of the looper is getting the clock. Let's say you also want to control that looper with a hardware MIDI controller. Most devices only have one MIDI input, so if you just have the one MIDI in and you want to send MIDI sync and you also want to control it with a controller, in a case like that, you need a controller that has a MIDI input so that it can receive the sync and then transmit that sync out, either through a MIDI output, or some devices will have what's called a MIDI through jack, and that's designed to take whatever it sees at the input and then pipe that out immediately through the through. Aside from synchronization issues, you might find that you also want a MIDI input if you're using more than one MIDI controller with the device. I've done some work with using both the Arturia Beatstep and the Morningstar. I like that a lot. I like the options that it gives me. But in a situation like that, the Arturia has to come first because, again, the Arturia doesn't have an input. For MIDI, it only has a MIDI out. So the Arturia has to go MIDI out into the MIDI input on the Morningstar, or I could do that with the Behringer as well. And then the device with the MIDI input, in this case the Morningstar or the Behringer, would then see the signal that's coming from MIDI in and then send those signals back through the MIDI out. So you would plug the Arturia into a pedal, you would plug the pedal into your looper, and then you would have things configured so that the Arturia commands were being piped through the MIDI in and out of the pedal, and that's how the looper would eventually see those commands. You can run into latency. Potentially. I have not had an issue with that. I've basically run the Beatstep into one foot controller and then that foot controller into a looper. If there is latency or delay from between when I activate a function and when it hits the looper, I haven't noticed it yet. Some people are more or less sensitive to that kind of thing than others, but if you're planning on either using a MIDI controller at the same time that you want to have MIDI synchronization going on, or if you're thinking about having multiple MIDI controllers for the same device, see if it's got a MIDI input, because that will make life a lot easier. These next two are pretty geeky, but depending on your orientation, they might be important. One is, how many simultaneous commands can you send from one button or switch at a time? So, for instance, the Beatstep basically lets you send one command per button. So you can have this be a note command, a continuous control command, a program change command, but it will only do one command basically at a time. So for the Behringer, for instance, you can send at least one or two program change commands, you can send 3 or 4 different continuous controller commands, and you can send at least 1 or 2 note commands just on one pedal. The Morningstar is extremely deep in that regard. You can have a lot of different functions assigned, not just to a pedal, but you can have some functions assigned when you press the pedal down. You can have different functions assigned when you release the pedal. You can have other functions sent if you hold the pedal down and then hold it down for a little while. So it's extremely deep in that regard. Whether or not you need this is up for debate. Statistically speaking, you probably don't. The main reason that I see people wanting to have that functionality is if, for instance, somebody has a board full of guitar pedals and they want to have it set up so that they can push a switch and instantly change the preset on 5 different MIDI-capable effects pedals. So you want to change the patch on your reverb and your distortion and your delay and your fuzzbox all at the same time. If they will receive MIDI program change commands, and if you can send out 4 different program change commands at the same time, then you can do that. Do you need to do that? Again, that's going to be down to individual use. For me personally, I don't use presets very often at all. So that's not something that I find myself needing to use. One thing I do like about having multiple commands is that you can get certain functionality that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So for instance, one thing I've been experimenting with the Morningstar controller is being able to hack momentary functionality. So in other words, momentary functionality is designed so that you press it down, the function begins, you release it, and the function ends. Toggle functionality is you press and release once to start it, you press and release a second time, and that turns the function off. Now, a lot of devices only have toggle functionality. So that means that if you do this, That's turning the function on. Then you have to do it a second time to turn it off. What I found you can do with the Morningstar is if you send both a note on and a note off command right after each other on the pressing of a button, and then you send another note on and note off command on the release of the button, you can make momentary functionality happen. If you're using a device that uses continuous controllers, similar kind of thing. Let's say that a positive controller value turns on a function and a value of 0 turns off the function. So continuous controller, positive value, and then right after that on the same button press, sending a value of 0, that would be interpreted by a device as being the equivalent of doing this and this. And then when you release it, you can send another basically doubled up collection of on and off commands. So basically, even though you're just doing this, the MIDI device thinks that you're doing this. So in cases like that, it's really cool because you can get momentary functionality out of devices that don't have it. Another thing that I've done is for devices where you have to turn overdub off before you can change the pitch or change the direction, I've set up some banks on the Morningstar where I have a button dedicated for reverse, for instance, but right before reverse, it sends an overdub command. So basically, I can be in overdub. If I want to go into reverse, I can push that customize button and it will immediately switch overdub off, reverse it, and then switch overdub back on. We're going to be talking about that kind of functionality on the Morningstar a lot pretty soon. So there'll be a lot of demonstrations with actual audio and music and that kind of thing happening. It's a pretty esoteric application of technology. It's probably not something everybody's going to need, but it is something to keep in mind. So basically, it's a question of how many commands can you send at a time? Can you send different commands on the press and release of a function? And can you double up commands? In other words, can you have like a note on and a note off right after each other, both happening immediately when you press something? Or can you have the same continuous controller immediately go through two different values just on the press or the release of a switch? The tactile feel of the buttons is a consideration. Different pedals have different feels. The Behringer has a very kind of stiff pedal feel to it. When I first got the Behringer, it took me a while to get used to how much force is required to trigger functions. The analogy I use is that the Behringer kind of feels like playing a steel string acoustic guitar with high action. I came to the Behringer from a Digitech PMC-10, and the tactile feel on the Digitech was much more forgiving. In other words, when I switched to the Behringer, I found that I had to kind of polish up my foot pedal technique, much in the same way that if somebody's used to playing electric guitar with thin strings and then they go to an acoustic, there's probably going to be a switchover period where they need to like retool their technique in order to adapt their touch for an acoustic guitar. One thing that I found going from the Digitech PMC-10 to the Behringer is that once I got the hang of the physical feel of the Behringer pedals, I was able to get shorter function length. So the shortest I was ever able to get something happening on the PMC-10 was, I think, 2 milliseconds. Once I got my chops up on the Behringer, I was able to get things happening that were like 1 millisecond long. So not a lot of people are going to care about 1 millisecond versus 2 milliseconds worth of latency. And honestly, it's not something that I think I need to have myself. But some people are more sensitive to this stuff than others. So you may find that you can feel the latency in your controller. I'm a little skeptical about this for the following reason. Latency is something that exists in nature. In other words, sound travels very slowly compared to light. Sound travels at about 1 foot per millisecond. That means that if I'm standing 3 feet away from an amp and I play a note into the amp, it's actually going to take 3 milliseconds for the sound to travel from the amp speaker back to my ear. And, you know, it can be easy to fixate on latency when it comes to electronic music and when it comes to buffers and that kind of thing. But it's worth remembering that latency is something that exists in nature. If I'm standing 10 feet away from a drummer, then I'm experiencing 10 milliseconds of latency between when the drummer is hitting their snare and when I'm actually hearing the sound of that snare coming back at me. If I move so that I'm 5 feet closer to the drummer, now I'm only experiencing 5 milliseconds of latency. If I walk around while I'm playing, then I have variable latency. So I understand the concern about MIDI latency. It's good to be aware of, it's good to check it out, but also good to remember, in my opinion, that latency does exist in nature, and it's something that we do deal with every day as people who listen to sound in our environment with our ears, completely irrespective of anything having to do with MIDI or digital audio or anything like that. I told you that this was going to get geeky. This is not the final word on MIDI controllers by any means, either in general or in terms of my own personal use. But hopefully this video and the previous one can provide some guidelines on how to go about navigating the array of available controllers and help us narrow down what kinds of functionality we need and how we want to apply it. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.